Solomon answered God, "You have shown great kindness to David my father, and have made me king in this place. Now, Lord God, let your promise to my father David be confirmed, for you have made me king over who are as numerous as the dust of the earth. Give me wisdom, knowledge, that I may lead this people. Or who is able to govern people of yours?" God said to Solomon, "Since this is your heart's desire, and you have not asked for wealth, riches, or honor, nor for the death of your enemies, and since you have not asked for a long life, but for wisdom and knowledge, to govern my people, over whom I have made you king. Therefore, wisdom and knowledge will be given you, and I will also give you wealth, riches, and honor, such as no king who was before you ever had, and none after you will have." James 1:5-8. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. But when he asks, he must believe and not doubt, because he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That man should not think he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all he does. In the third place, Proverbs 4:5-9. Get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forsake my words or swerve from them. Do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. Wisdom is supreme. Therefore, get wisdom. Though it cost you all you have, get understanding. Esteem her, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. She will set a garland of grace on your head and present you with a crown of splendor. Mr. Speaker, Honorable Prime Minister Hubert Alexander Minnis, Honorable Members of Parliament, in his Proverbs of 31 chapters, I am recommending that you read and digest a chapter a day. If you're not doing so, shall we pray? May the strength of God pilot you. May the power of God preserve you. May the wisdom of God instruct you. May the way of God direct you. Finally, we pray, God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, wisdom to know the difference. In Jesus' name. We now pray, Our Father, in heaven, be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, as in heaven. This day, our trespasses, as we forgive those, lead us not into temptation, yours from you, for thine is the kingdom, and the glory, forever and ever. Wonderful day.
Dr. Hubert Minnis, Peter Turnquest, Brent Simonet, Desmond Bannister, Renwood Wells, Jeffrey Lloyd, Dr. Dwayne Sands, Marvin Dames, Frankie Campbell, Dionisio Diagula, Michael Pintard, Darren Henfield, Romuald Ferreira, Lanisha Roll, Renzo Roll, Ellsworth Johnson, Philip Davis, Juan Miller, Takesha Parker Edgecombe, Iram Lewis, Carlton Bowleg, James Aubrey, Travis Robinson, Adrian Gibson, Donald Saunders, Frederick McAlpine, Hank Johnson, Mark Hume, Michael Fultz, Miriam Refi Emmanuel, Reese Shipman, Reuben Rami, Ricky Mackey, Shannon Dawn Cartwright, Charnel Ferguson, Glennis Hannah Martin, Tyso Forbes, Chester Cooper.
Good morning, honorable members. Introduction and swearing in of new members. Laying of documents by ministers. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Marathon.
Morning, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to lay on the table of the House a copy of the following. The Planning and Subdivision Zoning Golf Course Estates La Playa Order, 2018.
Order that the document be brought up. Sign. Order that the document to lie on the table. For the laying of documents by ministers, the chair recognizes the honorable member for Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to lay on the table of the House a copy of the following. 1. The Electricity Amendment Act 2018, appointed day notice 2018. Secondly, sir, Electricity Rate Reduction Bond Amendment Act 2018, appointed day notice 2018.
Order that the documents be brought up. Order that the documents do lie on the table. For the laying of documents by ministers, the chair recognizes the honorable member for Kalani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to lay on the table of the House a copy of the following. Freedom of Information Act 2017, appointed date notice 2018.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document do lie on the table. No. For the laying of documents by ministers. None, sir. Statements and communications by ministers. The chair recognizes the honorable member for South Beach.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. Speaker. Speaker, may I beg your leave to make a report to this House on my recent trip to the 20th Conference of Commonwealth Education Ministers that was held in Nadi, Fiji, beginning on the 19th of February, ending on the 23rd. Mr. Speaker, this conference was the 20th such conference of Commonwealth Education Ministers, a conference which began in 1959, which is held every 3 years at a rotating Commonwealth country. The conference was under the theme, Sustainability and Resilience, Can Education Deliver? And it was hosted by the Honorable Minister Syed Qayyum, who is the Attorney General and the Minister of Education of Fiji, and also under the auspices of the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Right Honorable Patricia Scotland, QC EMG. Mr. Speaker, this is the first conference of Commonwealth Education Ministers since the global community adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, a meeting which would give education ministers the opportunity to agree on effective strategies to help individual countries achieve Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which speaks specifically to education, and that is inclusive and equitable education for all and the promotion of lifelong learning. It was an opportunity, as all 20 conferences, to share knowledge and good practices, as well as to collaborate with other groups attending, such groups known as the Integrated Partners Forum, which would have included union organizations, Commonwealth student representatives, higher education leaders, civil society organizations, and teacher groups. As I indicated, sir, the conference began in 1959. It is held every year, every 3 years, and that first meeting was held in Oxford, England. This conference is the second largest meeting organized by the Commonwealth Secretariat, and it is usually either in advance or immediately after the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, CHOGM. Again, as I said, Mr. Speaker, the theme for this year was sustainability and resilience. Can education deliver? And it had 3 sub-themes. Education for sustainable development, number 1. Building resilience through education. And education, governance, and management. I wish to advise the Honorable House, Mr. Speaker, that this conference was held here in the Bahamas in June of 2015, the 19th CCEM. And at that time, the declaration called for several very important things which have, in a sense, changed, upgraded, evolved the character of CCEM, this Conference of Education Commonwealth Ministers. The Nassau Declaration called for a small states forum. As you would know, Mr. Speaker, of the many Commonwealth countries, there are a number of very large countries, like India, and many countries out of Africa, as well as Australia, United Kingdom. But there are smaller countries, such as the Bahamas and Fiji and St. Lucia and so on. And this, through our own initiative at the 19th CCEM, enabled an opportunity for, at the CCEM, to facilitate what we call a small states forum, which the Bahamas, in my person, Mr. Speaker, had the privilege to chair at this time. It was also through the Nassau Declaration that there would be an increasing the level of substance of dialogue between ministers and other attendees, a Commonwealth Accelerated Development Mechanism, which is by the acronym CADME, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, the establishment of an Education Ministers Action Group, or commonly known as EMAG. There are 10 countries that make up the EMAG. These countries represent the Commonwealth regions, 3 countries from Africa, 2 from Asia, 2 from the Caribbean, 1 from Europe, and 2 from the Pacific. The Bahamas and St. Lucia represents the Caribbean countries. Because we were the chair of the 19th EMAG, the 19th CCEM, Mr. Speaker, we then also assumed chairmanship of the EMAG, which succeeded that conference. And at this particular 20th CCEM in Fiji, the Bahamas, after providing a report on the achievements and successes and notes of the previous 3 years, handed on the chairmanship to Fiji and the Honorable Kayed Sayoum. The EMAG is extremely important, Mr. Speaker. The because it enables education ministers in this particular group to design and implement strategies to accomplish what is agreed at each conference. That agreement is confined to what is known as a declaration. In Fiji, Mr. Speaker, the Commonwealth ministers came to understanding, an agreement, and obligations which was known as the Nadi Declaration. And there were several obligations among the 50, I will not go through all of them this morning, that I would like to bring to the attention of the House of Assembly. It was re-emphasized, and ministers agreed, that high-quality teaching is a priority, and that member states should focus on how teachers and school leaders are trained, retrained, recruited, and motivated, and how the profession is governed. Ministers also agreed, Mr. Speaker, to strengthen education management systems so that they can be used to collect and to aggregate accurate, timely, and relevant data to assure quality and evaluate results against targets. And may I respectfully advise this Honorable House, Mr. Speaker, that that is one of the initiatives in particular, along with the making teaching priority, that this government is committed to pursue most aggressively. Further, ministers also agreed to promote the inclusion of education for sustainable development in the curriculum, with particular emphasis, sir, on technical and vocational education and training. Further, ministers committed to this process and curriculum known as early childhood education, noting the importance of providing all children with access to quality early childhood education, and recognize the need for the investment, considerable, copious investment in early learning, with a goal of providing universal pre-primary, or which would have been ordinarily known as preschool education. In technical and vocational education and training, Mr. Speaker, please forgive me, sir, ministers noted the concern of the high rates of youth unemployment in rapidly changing job markets, the increased numbers of young people, including both those who have dropped out of school and school leavers, entering the labor market with little or no skills for employability or entrepreneurship in many Commonwealth member states. Ministers therefore noted that it would be crucial to bridge this, what sometimes has been regarded as a weak bridge, so that providers of TVET or vocational education and employers would be able to match the needs of the industry along with the design of respective particular curriculum. Mr. Speaker, finally, because the Bahamas served as the immediate past chair of the Commonwealth Education Ministers Conference, Bahamas has agreed to serve on the committee of the EMAG, Education Ministers Action Group, in support of the new chair, which is Commonwealth of the Republic of Fiji. I'm obliged, sir.
Honorable Member, are you tabling?
Yes, I am.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document to lie on the table. Further statements and communications by ministers. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Sea Breeze.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Bahamas joins countries around the world in observing International Women's Day 2018, which is celebrated every year on March 8th. The theme for this year is Challenges and Opportunities in Achieving Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Rural Women and Girls. Mr. Speaker, Start again. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the Bahamas joins countries around the world in observing International Women's Day, which is celebrated every year on March 8th. The theme for this year is Challenges and Opportunities in Achieving Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Rural Women and Girls. For the Bahamas, Mr. Speaker, this theme focuses on women and girls who live in the remote areas of our archipelago, namely the Family Islands. The theme encourages the society to recognize that rural women have particular needs and should be given opportunities for their empowerment. Over the years, Mr. Speaker, women living in rural communities have been challenged with limited weekly air and sea travel to and from these islands, as well as intra-island travel due to the long distances between communities. Limited or no access to banking services, devastating damages from natural disasters, and low employment opportunities only compound the plight of women in these communities. Mr. Speaker, despite these challenges, the women in these communities have been resilient and strong. Many of them have managed to eke out a livelihood through sheer grit and determination, using the natural resources around them to become skilled in straw craft, in farming, fishing, and making preservatives. As a result, they have been able to sustain their families and remain in their communities. Mr. Speaker, it is incumbent upon this and successive governments to provide opportunities for native business development and family island entrepreneurial success. The internet, information, technology, and communication have empowered women and girls in these remote communities. Educationally, students can access the same information as their fellow students in New Providence, thus putting them in contention for scholarships and awards. Women can connect with family and friends and establish online businesses which have been economically empowering. The public is invited, Mr. Speaker, to watch a special video documentary sponsored by the Department of Gender and Family Affairs, which will be aired tomorrow on ZNS at 8 p.m., showcasing the determination of women and girls in rural communities in the Bahamas. We encourage you to assist and support our women in strengthening their communities for the building of our families and indeed our country. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Gender is also hosting a Women's Empowerment Forum at 10 a.m. tomorrow, International Women's Day, at the Harry C. Moore Auditorium, University of the Bahamas. The session provides for a space for women and girls to voice their concerns and raise awareness to issues that affect their ability to grow and to be empowered. Mr. Speaker, I salute the women of the Family Islands and all women of the Bahamas and around the world as we celebrate International Women's Day 2018. On behalf, Mr. Speaker, of my Prime Minister, our Cabinet colleagues, honorable members, particularly female parliamentarians, Ms. Chanel Ferguson, Ms. Miriam Emanuel, Ms. Pakeisha Parker Edgecombe, Mr. Speaker, and that of my senior, the Honorable Glenys Hannah Martin, and on my own behalf, may women continue in this country and around the world to advance forward, upward, onward, together. Happy International Women's Day.
Honorable member, are you tabling that document? Okay. Thank you. Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document to lie on the table. Further statements and communications by ministers. Pardon? Just before we move to the order of the day, the honorable member for North Eleuthera has given the chair notice that he wished to address a matter of urgent concern within the North Eleuthera district and the island of Eleuthera as a whole. The chair recognizes the honorable member for North Eleuthera.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am indeed privileged to stand in this place on behalf of the people of North Eleuthera to address a vexing situation that we are currently ensuring. Many of you are aware of the fluid situation as it relates to the glass window bridge. I'm sure you've seen numerous videos and messages as it relates to what has been occurring there as a result of the severe weather that has been taking place in that area. As of Sunday night, the glass window bridge was closed because of the severe weather that was affecting that area. In addition to that, there's a young man that has been missing as of Monday morning who hails from the state of Michigan. Efforts have been done to locate him. To this date, it has been to no avail. But more so than that, many of you are aware that the glass window bridge is an artery that allows for the flow of persons and material, because North Eleuthera is the breadbasket of Eleuthera. And I think the help that it extends far exceeds just North Eleuthera. You have persons hailing from all over the Bahamas that have come to North Eleuthera for gainful employment. And as such, the vital importance of that bridge is extremely important for the day-to-day operation of the area. After the bridge was being severely beaten by waves, we had requested from the Minister of Works, who quickly responded by dispatching the two top engineers from the Ministry of Works to do an assessment of the bridge. It was Mr. Robert Musas, who's the chief engineer, and Mr. David Cox, who's the Family Island engineer. They came to North Eleuthera on Tuesday morning, which was yesterday. They could not do a full assessment because the weather is still pretty much raging, and so a clear assessment was not able to be done. They are anticipated to come back on Friday morning, at which time we are hoping that a true assessment of the bridge and the surrounding areas that have been affected by the weather would be done. As a result of the closure of the bridge, persons started to migrate to the northern side by way of boats. That became a concern, and so what took place, I, along with the administrator, the chief counselor for North Eleuthera, the town committee chairperson for Gregory Town, we got together. We went in the vicinity of the bridge to do an assessment. We later dispatched the port officer to examine the boats that was transporting persons from Gregorytown area across the northern part of the bridge, for him to do an assessment of the vessels to ensure that they were seaworthy, and also that life vests would be on board the boats. We also ensured that those vessels would have been licensed in order to transport these persons to their various destinations. In addition to that, it was extremely difficult for the persons to load on board these boats because there were no docks in the area. With the agreement of all parties involved, a dock was constructed yesterday and should be completed by now to accommodate vessels for individuals to be able to load and offload carrying persons from the northern side of the bridge to the southern side. This took basically all day yesterday in order to get this done. However, as a result of a shift in the weather this morning, the vessels, the boats that we were using to transport persons were no longer able in order to do so. Hence, another catastrophe took place. Persons deemed upon themselves, despite the fact that the bridge has been closed till Sunday, attempted to cross the bridge. At which time, early this morning, 8 persons attempting to cross the bridge, 5 persons were washed off. 5 of them have been severely injured, but there's been no loss of life. I must stress in the strongest terms that persons do not attempt to cross that bridge. Barricades have been put on both sides of the bridge to prohibit that. And instructions have now been going out to ensure that there'll be no crossings. The police have been instructed to man both sides to prohibit any further crossings of that bridge. But just to make you aware of some of the efforts we've done to curtail the severity of this situation, I've reached out to all of the hotel owners who have employees that work south of the bridge, and they've consented that if their staff is on the schedule, they will pay them so they don't have to come into work. They've also agreed to offset the cost, because when persons start to transport persons by way of boats, some price gouging started to take place. We've been able to regularize that and set a standard fare that we feel is fair to both the participants as well as the boat operators. I must say that the hotel owners have been very forthwith and have agreed to absorb that cost. In addition to that, we've had conversations with someone to provide bus service from the bridge to 3 Island, where the bulk of the persons travel to for employment. In fact, we were hoping to have that resolved in terms of the plan is for 4 round trips per day, but we needed to have a conversation with the hotel owners in order to when we will schedule these trips. So efforts were being made in order to make easy the way of life under these extreme situations. It has also come to our attention that some of the airlines, now realizing the situation, are requesting that they now fly maybe into Governor's Harbor. That is a conversation we will have to have. But we had also reached out to the airlines to allow them, or to tell them, or to inform them that the transportation that was being provided from the northern end of the bridge to the southern end would have sufficed in order for their passengers to travel. This bridge is a very important artery for the continuous life of North Eleuthera. And that is why I am so thrilled that the Minister of Works was there a few weeks ahead and had agreed that something has to be done with reference to this bridge. Now the reality of that need is upon us, and moving forward, we will expect nothing less than our government to move forward in executing that. The people of North Eleuthera are grateful for the many efforts that the government have showed in the past, but we beg and beseech you now going forward to help us get beyond this. And I make one last plea to the residents of North Eleuthera. A dollar cannot be that important that you risk your life for. And so we're going to move forward. Somehow we're going to get across this. We can't say when the bridge will be open. We will wait on Friday when the experts come in and do an assessment of the bridge, as well as the big hole in the road that is a result of the water streaming across. And then and only then, when a true assessment is done, we will be able to advise moving forward as to the opening of that bridge or that passageway. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am so pleased that you allowed me to convey to this House and the wider Bahamas. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Member. The Chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Cat Island, Rumkey, and San Salvador.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to thank the member for North Eleuthera for his impassioned plea to the residents of Eleuthera, and to perhaps add more authoritative voice to the warnings that have been previously issued only by the Met Department. I had anticipated or had intended to raise this matter, and I'm heartened to see that the member for North Eleuthera is on top of the situation. Because, Mr. Speaker, you know, over the last several months, we've had several weather-related deaths, and the silence of the government, or what I call the authoritative voice over these matters, was deafening. Mr. Speaker, we had a plane crash with 6 lives. In Bimini, there were 2. Auckland, there are 2 persons missing. Abaco, I'm advised there's another missing. Of course, we heard of what's happening in North Eleuthera. All I'm asking and urging is that the government take and lend a more authoritative voice to the warnings that's being issued in respect to what these weather-related, the danger of not heeding to the advices that would be issued from the Met Department. And so it's not just North Eleuthera. You're hearing about what's happening down in Auckland, Abaco. And so it would be, as I said, I'm pleased to note that the member for North Eleuthera has, because the incident that occurred this morning, I think it was, the 5 or 6 persons being injured, was brought to my attention. Hence, I had anticipated or had intended to raise the matter. But I just urge that the government lend its more authoritative voice to the warnings that's issued by the Weather Department.
Thank you, Honorable Member. The Chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Angliston.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, I want to raise an issue of urgent public importance relative to, like the Prime Minister, the member for Kalani, gave a communication on the 14th of February forecasting the signing. Yes.
Honorable Member.
Yes.
Is this the matter?
This is the matter. Yes, this is the matter, Speaker.
Honorable Member.
This is an urgent matter, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member.
Maine people are very concerned.
Honorable Member. If this is a matter you're considering as a matter of immediate public importance, and then we must move pursuant to Rule 51.
I'm sure North Eleuthera also moved pursuant to that rule, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, North Eleuthera gave me notice.
I gave you notice too, Mr. Speaker. It was not in writing, but I gave you notice with the leader of opposition business in the in your chambers. Speaker.
Yes.
The heads of agreement was signed.
Hold on,
in the public domain,
honorable
Mr.
member.
Speaker,
Honorable member. Have
which
your
does
seat.
not reflect.
Honorable member. Honorable member. Honorable member, have your seat, please. With respect, with respect to the matter that the honorable member for Angleston is seeking to raise, if we examine Rule 51(1), a member may propose to the Speaker that a critical matter of immediate public importance be submitted to the House for discussion. The member proposing the matter shall present to the Speaker at least 1 hour before the time fixed for the sitting of the House a written statement of the matter proposed to be debated. If the Speaker, and this is the important part, if the Speaker determines that it is in order, he shall so inform the House. Now, based on the issue that was discussed with the Speaker in the presence of the member for Central and South Andros, only 5 to 10 minutes before the sitting of the House, and there was no written statement. The chair is of the view that the matter is premature. It is extremely provocative and controversial, and so it is the ruling of the chair that leave is not granted at this time, and that the proper procedure should be followed, in that I expect to receive some written statement, and in any event, the matter would not be heard at this present sitting, pursuant to the rules. And so, the chair, the decision of the chair is that leave is not granted for that matter to be raised at this time.
Indulgence, as the chair indulged the member for North Eleuthera.
No, this is a completely different matter.
It is?
It is.
I thought it was a matter of public importance, Speaker. The heads of agreement,
honorable member, honorable member, may have your seat. The decision of the chair is that with respect to the member for North Eleuthera, the member for North Eleuthera is raising an urgent matter that is not controversial, that is not provocative, that will not provoke a debate. This matter is completely different, and no written notice has been given, and in any event, it is the ruling of the chair that leave is not granted for the matter to be raised at this time. Order of business for the day. The chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to move the resolution that was order of the day. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to move a resolution, the following resolution, to be agreed by the House. Whereas Article 129.1 of the Constitution requires the Minister of Finance, before the end of each fiscal year, to cause to be prepared annual estimates of revenue and expenditure.
Honorable member. Honorable member.
I'm giving you the order today.
What? No, no. Yeah. Page 56. Honorable members. Honorable members, if I can direct honorable members to page 56. Orders of the day. In the rules, 63(1 states, an order of the day is a bill or other motion which has been set down for consideration during that day's sitting, right? The government orders of the day shall be taken in the order determined by government before or during the sitting and may be postponed on motion without notice. Now, the chair recognizes the honorable member for Cat Island.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no controversy. The order of the day is that if during the course of if after you started, there was a matter that came up and we decide to move order of the day. This is a resolution that we got notice of from last week.
Yes.
So all we need to do is go down the list of go down the order, and when you get to S, when you get to S, then he speaks. That's all. Instead of making controversy.
Comply with the rules. I gotta comply to the rules. We get the S here.
Why you don't have to?
You want to comply to the rules?
No.
Order of the day is
Okay.
everything.
What rule? What rule you? When? Where? No. Read. This, Mr. Speaker. The point is that this resolution or motion was not put today. It was not put today. Just go down the agenda. That's all.
Well, there isn't a difficulty. There isn't a difficulty. The chair can exercise its discretion with respect to the order of business and on motion permit an order of the day. That's all was happening. But so to avoid any controversy, and so it cannot be said that the speaker was not following the rules, we will go down the order of business. Communications by the clerk. Messages from the Governor General. Messages from the Senate. Notions for leave of absence, leave to resign seat, and new writs. Presentation of petitions. Presentation of reports of committees. Adoption of reports of committees. First reading of bills. Second reading and committal of bills. Committee of the whole House. Third reading and passing of bills. Consideration of Senate amendments. Resolutions. The chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Mahama.
Mr. Speaker, sometimes it here is so interesting. It is so interesting. Mr. Speaker, no, that's okay. It's okay. It's okay. You can explain later. You can explain later. You can explain later. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move.
Is Grandmama, are you yielding?
No, I'm not, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you why I wouldn't yield. It's because, you know, can we consistently give the minority an opportunity to speak? And it's like every time that we do that, rather than using that time in a positive, productive way, they use it to try and blindside the government. At some point, no, there's no point of order. There's no point of order.
Honorable member, he's on the point of order. Honorable member The chair recognizes the honorable member for Cat Island, Rumkey, and San Salvador.
Ask the member to identify when it was that I may have to do it. No, I didn't do it, Mr. Speaker. All I attempted to do is to explain why it was important that you go through the order of the day. Right? And that is because I know what the rule speaks to. That's all I was attempting to show. If they don't want to understand it, because there's a junior member who said we are wasting time. No, we are not. We are not wasting time, Mr. Speaker, because the Hansard record would show that you would have gone down the order of the day in accordance with the rules require, and then when he got to resolution, he spoke. That's what it means. There's nothing wrong with that. What the records would have shown is that you did not go through the order of the day, and he started to speak on the motion.
An honorable member.
What is controversial about that?
I accept your explanation, but I'm also stating from the chair that it is not out of order for the chair to permit order of business to be interrupted by an order of the day motion. It's not unusual for that to happen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, not to raise more controversy, but the member obviously forgot that he stood up a little while earlier to try and chastise the government with respect to speaking, as he puts it, more authoritatively to the situations in weather situations that we've been experiencing the last few days, which I consider a cheap shot, Mr. Speaker, because the truth of the matter is that if government is allowed to work, then there's no reason for the government to get involved in those kind of things. The systems of government ought to work. But be that as it may, I understand. Mr. Speaker, I now move that the following resolution be agreed. Whereas Article 129(1) of the Constitution requires the Minister of Finance before the end of each financial year to cause to be prepared annual estimates of revenue and expenditure for public services during the succeeding fiscal year, which shall be laid before the House of Assembly, and which estimates have been laid before the House of Assembly. And whereas it is necessary to undertake additional borrowings to facilitate financing, provide financing to facilitate Bahamas Resolve Limited retiring promissory notes, which in aggregate total over $100 million, to the Bank of the Bahamas, of which the government has expended funds from the existing approved estimates during the first half of fiscal 2017-18, which has been laid before the House of Assembly. And whereas Section 4 of the Bahamas Registered Stock Act, Chapter 362, prescribes the conditions under which the Minister of Finance may raise money by the creation and issue of registered stock, and whereas from time to time the House of Assembly has approved borrowing by way of loan agreements with banks to finance approved expenditure, and whereas Section 3 of the Development Loans Act, Chapter 382, prescribes the conditions under which the Minister of Finance may borrow externally or internally any amount not exceeding in the aggregate the equivalent of $100 million in currency of the United States of America, or such greater sum as the House of Assembly may by resolution direct by the issue and sale of bonds. And whereas by Section 18 of the Financial Administration and Audit Act 2010, number 26 of 2010, it is provided that no loans shall be raised by the government and no guarantees involving a financial liability shall be binding upon the government unless entered into with the prior approval of the House of Assembly, signified by resolution thereof. Now therefore be it resolved that this House, 1, authorizes the Minister of Finance to raise by way of loan or loans the sum of $100 million in the aggregate in such currency as the Minister may determine. 2, authorizes the Minister to raise such amounts by way of A, the creation and issue of stock under the provisions of Bahamas Registered Stock Act, Chapter 362, B, loan agreements with banks, including commercial banks, on such terms as are mutually agreed, and C, the issue of bonds under the provisions of the Development Loans Act, Chapter 382, subject to the provisions that the total sum borrowed under paragraph B does not exceed the sum of $100 million necessary to replenish resources expended to invest in Bahamas Resolve Limited, and the House receives communication from the Minister of Finance at the earliest opportunity after the apportionment among A, B, and C, and 3, approves the proceeds of the said loans being used for the purposes of defraying expenditure related to the investment in Bahamas Resolve Limited. Mr. Speaker, before I get into my substantive contribution to this, I just wanted to give a report on my recent trip to Jamaica to attend the 7th annual consultation with the Caribbean governors of the Inter-American Development Bank. The meeting is an annual meeting of Caribbean governors where they meet to discuss issues that are of more relevance to the Caribbean community. Prior to the annual meeting, which will be held on the 21st of March in Mendoza, Argentina. This meeting is intended to be more of a more intimate nature because in the wider body, sometimes the issues that affect us in a more direct way get superseded by the agenda of the larger countries. At this particular meeting, we were able to discuss issues of climate resilience and, more importantly, the effects that technology developments can have on the efficiency and the ease of doing business. And this, Mr. Speaker, is of particular interest to us as the government because we believe that it can have significant positive effects on the way we do business in this country as well as we interact with our citizens and the wider world. And so we had the opportunity to meet with the bank and its experts. We had an opportunity to meet with Sir Richard Branson to talk about climate resilience and how technology can be an asset in rebuilding infrastructure in a more resilient way. And we had meetings with Mr. Thomas Ilves, the former president of Estonia, which is right now considered the world leader in e-governance, where we were able to talk to him about some of the challenges and the process that they went through in terms of modernizing their governance structure. And we had the opportunity he gave us some information that is going to be helpful in helping us to advance our agenda, as well as we had the opportunity to invite him to come to the Bahamas, probably at our next tech conference in Grand Bahama, to talk a little bit more about this e-governance model and the benefits that his country has derived from the investment that they have made. And so it was a very useful meeting, and we look forward to further dialogue as we go forward. Mr. Speaker, just to note for the members, as we debate this resolution, we will be also making our contribution towards the mid-year statement, as well as we would like to incorporate a second resolution that we will move at the end of this debate for the $90 million IDB loan facility, which has 3 components: airport infrastructure, job, skills, readiness, and climate resilience proposals to harden our defenses against some of the same effects that we see happening to our coastlines today. And so we will lay that at the end. And so I would just ask members, so that we don't repeat ourselves, that they include in their contributions any discussion, debate that they want to move forward with respect to that resolution at the same time. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, I presented a brief overview of the government's fiscal position at the midpoint of the 2017-18 fiscal year. At this time, I want to open the debate on that statement and provide additional details in the following areas, namely, a discussion on the global economic backdrop to fiscal developments and prospects for the Bahamian economy through the near term, a more fulsome recap of the state of the public finances at the mid-year, that is the period July 1 to December 31st, 2017, and a review of the major policy initiatives that we set out in the May budget communication as part of the government's overriding socio-economic growth agenda, and an update on the progress that we have made to date in respect of the implementation of those initiatives. As a small open economy, it goes without saying that the state of and outlook for the external economic environment are critical to an assessment of our own prospects for more buoyant growth and job creation. I am thus heartened to note that since the May budget communication, the forecasts for our major trading partners have decidedly improved, with strong and sustained growth projected to persist at least through the next 2 to 3 years. I recall that as we finalized the 2017-18 budget, the IMF had just released a somewhat more upbeat outlook for the growth of the global and U.S. economies than it had previously forecasted, on the basis of the deemed early signs of recovery in investment, manufacturing, and world trade. This news was indeed encouraging, as the world had to that point witnessed only modest growth that in the wake of the 2008-2009 global recession were relatively modest by historical standards post-recession. The fund remained cautious, however, as it saw clear risks to the outlook that, on balance, it felt trended to the downside. This caution reflected ongoing structural impediments to growth in the form of relatively low productivity growth and rising income inequality. At that time, there was also concern about the anticipated pace of monetary policy tightening in the United States. The latter factor was, however, counterbalanced by the ongoing cyclical recovery of consumption growth in that country, as well as prospects for more expansionary fiscal policy. At this juncture, as reflected in the latest World Economic Outlook, the IMF's concerns about the risk to the global economic outlook have moderated to an appreciable extent. The fund now asserts that global growth has in fact continued to strengthen, with global GDP having raised by 3.7% in 2017, up from the 3.5% forecasted last April. Quite striking is the fact that some 120 countries around the globe, accounting for 3/4 of world economic activity, recorded stronger growth in 2017. That, according to the IMF, represents the broadest synchronized global growth upsurge since 2010. Moreover, in contrast to 10 months ago, it is now estimated that the risks to the world economic outlook are broadly balanced through the near term. This more positive forecast reflects a spurt in global growth momentum, as well as the growth impact of the recently approved tax policy changes in the United States. As a result, the expansion of the world economy is now projected to be yet stronger in 2018 and 2019 at 3.9% in both years. In the US, tax reform is deemed to be the key factor in the short-term forecast for economic activity. Especially important in this regard are the reductions in corporate tax rates and the allowance, temporarily, of full expensing of investments. The net impact of these measures is estimated to lead to stronger growth of the US economy through 2020, with the level of GDP in that country expected to be some 1.2% higher than otherwise would have been the case. Accordingly, the IMF now forecasts the growth of the American economy at 2.7% in 2018, up from 2.5% forecasted last April. U.S. growth has been marked up yet more significantly in 2019 to a rate of 2.5% as compared to the forecast of 2.1% at the time of the May budget communication. These developments augur well for the prospects of stronger growth and job creation in the Bahamas. More specifically, as I explained in the mid-year statement, we expect the enhanced consumer and investor confidence in our major trading partner over the next 3 years to bolster tourism levels to and investment interest in the Bahamas. Economic activity in the Eurozone is also now projected to be more buoyant on the basis of stronger momentum in domestic and external demand. These nations are forecasted to grow by 2.2% in 2018 and 2% in 2019, up from the rate of 1.6% that had been previously projected for both years in April 2017. The growth forecast for other advanced economies has similarly been revised upwards. This is especially the case for the advanced Asian economies that are particularly sensitive to developments in global trade and investment. Likewise, the growth outlook for Canada, an important source market for our tourism sector, has been marked up in both 2018 and 19 to rates of 2.3% and 2% respectively. Mr. Speaker, turning to the Bahamian economy, in line with the brighter economic outlook globally and especially in the United States, the IMF has marked up its forecast for economic growth in the Bahamas. Real growth in 2018 is now forecasted at 2.5%, up from 2.2% at the time of the last budget. For 2019, the forecast called for growth on the order of 2.2%. This outlook reflects projected modest growth in tourism sector output. Thank you, Minister. Due in part to the sustained improvement in key sector markets, source markets, and in light of the multi-billion Bahama resort becoming fully operational. In addition, construction activity should be supported by a number of varied scaled foreign investment projects in both the capital and the Family Islands. And I say proudly, Grand Bahama. Oh, yeah. In this environment, employment conditions are expected to continue to gradually improve, while inflationary pressures should continue to be well contained over the near term, as international oil prices remain relatively low. As for monetary sector developments, the central bank expects continued high levels of bank liquidity to be a dominant feature. As well, credit conditions are likely to remain subdued, while bank arrears and non-performing loans should continue their downward trajectory, underpinned mainly by additional asset sales and ongoing loan recovery efforts. And further, banks are projected to stay highly capitalized, thereby mitigating any threat to the financial sector stability. Developments in respect of external reserves are expected to depend heavily on factors such as the performance of foreign exchange earning sectors, international crude oil prices, and the government financing activities. However, external reserve indicators are likely to remain above international benchmarks during the year. At the end of January, external reserves totaled $1,460.5 million, equivalent to 5.5 months of total merchandise imports and well above the benchmark of 3 months. Mr. Speaker, to properly understand the government's fiscal consolidation strategy and the state of the public finances at the midpoint of the 2017-18 fiscal year, it is necessary to begin with a realistic and thorough assessment of the gravity of the fiscal challenges that our government has inherited from the previous administration. Mr. Speaker, irrespective of the baseless and empty rhetoric that we have heard following the presentation of the mid-year statement, our government does have a very clear guiding vision for a better future for Bahamians, with both a stronger economy and enhancing job opportunities. We also have a plan, Exuma, for getting there. We elaborated on this vision and plan in our 2017 manifesto, in the speech from the throne, as well as in the May budget communication. I will speak shortly at length about the numerous initiatives that we have launched to date to begin the full implementation of our ambitious, though vitally important socio-economic agenda for growth. As I made amply clear in the budget communication, we must, as a priority, address the fiscal mess that we inherited from the party opposite. We simply cannot and will not spend recklessly, as did the previous administration, without due regard for the financial resources that are available. Ours is now the task of putting order in the public finances of our nation, to arrest the seemingly inexorable, you know what I'm talking about. The exorbitant rise in the burden of government debt that hangs like the proverbial albatross around the neck of Bahamians and our economy. It is imperative that we return the burden of debt to lower, more sustainable levels in order to free up the critical resources that are necessary to fully implement the action plans within our socioeconomic growth agenda as promptly and efficiently as possible. Mr. Speaker, allow me to illustrate. More specifically, when the burden of government debt represents a more manageable and sustained 30% of GDP, the government's interest payment on the debt accounted for some 10% of every revenue dollar. Last fiscal year, with a debt burden of 57.6% of GDP, interest payments chewed up almost 14.5 cents of every revenue dollar. 14.5%. So debt to GDP at 30%, 10 cents in interest payments, 57.6%, 14.5% of every dollar that we earn go to pay interest, not to pay the principal, not to improve our infrastructure or services, but just to service the debt. Mr. Speaker, were it possible to return to a debt burden under which interest payments again accounted for 10% of revenues, our annual interest payments would be appreciably reduced. At the 2017-18 level of revenues, the savings would be on the order of $75 million. If we can get our debt burden back down to a manageable 30%, we can save $75 million a year. Isn't that incredible? Doesn't that make the case for fiscal conservancy and for discipline? We have to get back there. Those are precious financial resources indeed that could make a significant contribution to the advancement of the government's agenda for growth through, for example, supplementary investment in education, health, and or infrastructure, and airports. Even the one in Exuma. The one that he said, I saw a commentary by Exuma, and sorry to do this to Exuma, but I saw a commentary where he questioned when we laid the resolution for the $90 million from the IDB, where he criticized the government. He said, we're borrowing $90 million again, raising all of this money. But included in that resolution is the money that the government needs in order to build his airport, so that we can continue to improve the economy of Exuma, his people, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'm sure that he will explain to the people of Exuma and Ragged Island why he would have objected to the government borrowing necessary dollars, because his government left no money in the treasury for us to pay this out of pocket. So we got to borrow it. So I'm sure he will explain to his people what he meant by the government shouldn't borrow that money. You can explain during your contribution. I just made an observation. There's no point of order.
Point of order.
There's no point of order.
Members on the point of order.
There's no point of order.
Thank you very much,
Chair
Mr.
recognizes the honourable member for Exuma and Ragged Island.
Mr. Speaker, during the Minister of Finances is intentionally misleading, Mr. Speaker. During my budget presentation, around about May or June last year, I made the point that the previous government had organized the financing already via the IDB, and this government only needed to draw it down. So the fact that it is now happening, let me be very clear that the people of Exuma have been in long need for a proper airport, and we are delighted that this airport is now going to be built. But there are some things we need in the meantime, and I will speak to this, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I'm just obviously having a little bit of fun with my friend. but he would be happy to know that that airport is on the drawing board. It is intended to be intention of this government to follow through. And as a matter of fact, he would have been present when the Prime Minister would have toured Exuma just recently, including the airport, where they would have seen some things that needed immediate attention. And I'm advised that the Ministry of Works has already addressed some of those immediate defects. And so hopefully the situation at the current terminal is a little bit better, even though we recognize fully that it needs to be completely redone. And so don't worry, Exuma. All will be okay. Because the people of Exuma deserve nothing less than first class. And as I say that, I'm going to tell you that our sister island to the south, Long Island, even up to this morning, the member for Long Island, and Long Island, you're all some tough people, I got to tell you, you're all rough. Because the member for Long Island, even to this morning, is asking me, when are we going to get our investment in Long Island Airport? We need a new airport. I want no, don't get it confused. Acklands need a new airport too now. We can talk about that. But Long Island, we haven't forgotten you, and we haven't forgotten the promises that we've made to Long Island. So all I would say is stay tuned with respect to developments there. But Mr. Speaker, Fort Charlotte has a whole Clifford Park. What more you want? Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it needs to be stressed that much work needs to be done to get us to the type of debt burden objective that would be preferable. But we are firmly committed through our concrete fiscal consolidation plan to getting us moving in that direction. As a first step, that requires that we eliminate the annual government deficit that is the direct cause of increased borrowings. Eliminating the deficit and getting to a lower debt burden are also vital to recreating the fiscal room to maneuver that is prudently required to allow us to deal with unforeseen economic and other shocks, such as hurricanes that may present themselves in the period ahead. Mr. Speaker, it is impossible to overstress the importance of fiscal redress as an immediate priority. For government debt, if left unchecked, can generate its own vicious dynamic that feeds upon itself through higher debt servicing costs, higher deficits, and yet higher levels of debt. Indeed, simple extrapolations with a basic debt dynamic model, as is widely used internationally, reveals that with the primary deficit of 3.3% of GDP that we inherited, the ratio of government debt to GDP would rise continuously from its level of 57.6% in 2016-17, using our Department of Statistics revised GDP figures published late last year, to over 100% of GDP in only 9 short years. That's a significant point. That, needless to say, would have grave, deleterious consequences for both Bahamian society and our economy. It would also critically impair the ability of government to finance the economic and social programs and services that are cherished by our citizens. Mr. Speaker, the primary fiscal deficit to which I have just referred is the critical instrument that drives the level and growth of a nation's public debt burden. Quite simply, it represents the difference between discretionary government spending, excluding interest payments and debt redemption, and recurrent revenues. This measure of the fiscal situation is central to any fiscal consolidation plan, as it embodies the various fiscal levers over which the government has direct control, namely its revenues and its discretionary spending. And for those who don't understand, discretionary spending means those expenses, those programs that the government can voluntarily decide whether to proceed or to spend that money or not, as opposed to fixed expenditure such as rent or salaries that the government has very little control over. As we move ahead, our fiscal actions will be guided by the vital need to eliminate the primary deficit and then generate a surplus on the primary fiscal balance if we are to be successful in arresting and reversing the upward trend in the burden of government debt. Mr. Speaker, in assessing how our predecessors managed to create such a large primary fiscal deficit in their final year, I, for one, will not rely on the type of empty rhetoric that has recently been heard from the other side. Indeed, were it not so cynical and hypocritical, one would be tempted to laugh at the pointless posturing of the member for Exuma and Ragged Island, who suggested that the mid-year statement was based on so-called voodoo economics. In fact, his words are far from humorous. They are, in fact, questionable. I'm going to leave it there. Yeah, I'm being nice. I'm going to leave that there. That is sad, Mr. Speaker. For the body politic, Mr. Speaker, for the member for Exuma and Ragged Island, began his career with such promise. Indeed, early on, he himself professed that he represented a new breed of PLP, while rightly thrashing the dastardly transgressions of the previous regime. Finally, he's an F&M. Finally, y'all don't try to cause no problems for my friend. Finally, there was some hope that the party that had made an art form out of waste and corruption had finally found someone who would bring principled positions to the disaster, to that disaster of a political operation. Sadly, the nation's hope were misplaced and quickly vanished. But I'm not going to give up on him. I don't give up on him. I don't. I don't give up on him. I believe he's an honorable man, and I believe at the appropriate time that he will speak truth to power, as they say. He will speak truth to power, and like me, like me, sometimes you got to stand alone. Because this business of finance is not pretty. Everybody wants something, and they want it now. And they can't understand that they can't have it now. And so the truth of the matter is you become very unpopular very quickly. But that's the nature of our job. And we have to do what is right by the Bahamian people. Mr. Speaker, this honorable House and Bahamian citizens simply cannot abide by such denial of the facts, abdication of responsibility and accountability, and the fabrication of untruths to cover up the misdeeds of the past. It is thus my responsibility today to speak frankly of the truly nonsensical and shoddy financial husbandry that guided the opposition when it was in office. The truth about the previous government's fiscal and management record must be told. Bahamians need to see how they felt. No qualms in spending, like this now popular word, drunken sailors, without any concern whatsoever for the future generations of Bahamians that will be obligated to pick up the tab. And I do apologize to sailors. I apologize to the sailors. Clearly, the former administration was apparently so obsessed with keeping power that they were prepared to destroy the foundations of our nation's economic well-being in an ultimately futile attempt to stay in office. As a brief aside, Mr. Speaker, that is why it is so important that this government put in place fiscal responsibility legislation, so that if ever, Mr. Speaker, and we certainly hope not, another group of craven politicians ever manage to once again take the helm of this country, it would be our very laws that would constrain their disregard for the long-term well-being of our country. Never again must a government be able to write blank checks after blank checks to serve narrow and self-serving partisan interests to the detriment of the welfare of our country. Never again, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I mentioned that we faced a bare cupboard last May, I was trying to be polite, cupboard. When I mentioned that we faced a bare cupboard last May, I was not speaking in jest, for there is no humor in the financial morass that we inherited, and the one that so severely constrained the room in which we have had to maneuver. The situation was so grave that a brief recap is fully warranted again at this time. Indeed, our government walked into a most challenging environment in respect of the management and administration of public sector finances. The fiscal and management issues that this administration is having to address while cleaning up the fiscal mess left by our predecessors include a fragmented approach to the provision of IT services throughout government. Our own internal professionals had been sidelined, and a great measure of critical services outsourced to a range of vendors, including foreign vendors, with no oversight, strategy, or clear direction, and with no consideration of cost. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that cost was significant, or the need to develop Bahamian IT expertise in governance. Weak protocols and mechanisms for routine financial reporting and analysis, which means the policymakers do not get timely and usable information on key fiscal performance measures as they should. A central purchasing unit managing significant purchases of goods and services with little direct oversight and accountability. A $33 million project from the IDB to modernize public sector finances that had been drifting with little direction and no result. Any number of persons brought on as consultants, some not even being approved by cabinet, nor through the established procurement process, with ill-defined roles. a public treasury where the senior staff could get no assistance obtaining critical equipment, nor getting approval for much needed staff, despite the millions of dollars being frittered away. All because we suspect the treasurer was prepared to tell the former administration to follow the rules. A revenue enhancement project initiative and team, consisting at the time of more than $1 million a month to run, including expensive foreign consultants, without any evidence of cabinet approval. The initiative itself makes sense, and it is something the government is continuing much more economically. But it made no sense to create a revenue enhancement project where a significant quantum of the savings went right back to the cost. Cost, again, for which no cabinet approval was given, and for which most of the cost was to foreign consultants. A situation at the Department of Inland Revenue, where 2 years ago the significant ramp-up of the department to be able to administer VAT, the majority of the staff were still contract workers, many of whom had contracts that had expired. Millions, they talk about how we firing people and victimizing people. But they gave the people 6 months. 6 months is a luxury. Some of them had 3-month contracts. 3 months contracts, Mr. Speaker. And so when we let some of those people go, because quite frankly, yeah, sorry, not my bad. When we did not renew some of those contracts, that side wants to talk about victimization. But in my mind, victimization is when you give somebody a false hope, false pretenses. Give them the belief that they have something tangible that they can hold on to. It's abuse is what it really boils down to. It's abuse, Mr. Speaker. And then to stand up here and to have the gall to talk about victimization. Mr. Speaker, truly, it's a shame. It's a shame, Mr. Speaker. Millions of dollars of contracts being executed and administered directly through the Ministry of Finance, totally outside the procurement rules and the provision of the Financial Administration and Audit Act. For example, it is claimed that the former government committed $18 million to support the printing of the Bahamas Handbook and the in-room tourist guides, but it only paid $500,000 towards that bill. Wow. The former administration did not put this work out to contract, nor send it to Cabinet for approval. It is now left to our government to sort this matter out and investigate the $17.5 million that is supposedly still owed. Despite all the hoopla around the Bahamas Junkanoo Carnival Festival, the Ministry of Finance had engaged an accounting company which had not been paid through the resources of the Carnival Festival and which had been holding on to bills from last year. So the money that went to Carnival, 14 million I think it was, 19 million at the end I believe.
21 in total.
21, I'm corrected. Still didn't pay the accounting firm. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the previous government engaged in a shameless and extravagant pre-election spending spree. As we quickly discovered upon coming to office, that spree has left us with virtually untold millions in unpaid overhang commitments, which we must now deal with. Indeed, their overhang is of an order of magnitude that may well be unprecedented. To date, we have been able to ascertain just over 200 million in such commitments. These are summarized in an annex that I have to my contribution, and I'll read it if somebody wants me to do that. But unfortunately, it appears that this is not the end of the story, as new unpaid commitments continue to surface. Such irresponsible behavior, I just told you about $18 million, right? 60 million. There's $60 million in insurance, absolutely. And there's a $4 million one that just popped up in the last couple of weeks. Such irresponsible behavior by a government solemnly and faithfully elected by Bahamian citizens is simply unconscionable. No, I ain't talking about Bank of the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, I would submit that their betrayal of the Bahamian people's trust will and certainly should never be forgotten. Indeed, last year, the Bahamian people placed their sacred trust in our government to right the ship of state and implement the proactive socio-economic growth agenda that we promised as a means of bringing a better life and future to all. It is thus tragic that we have had to devote precious time and financial resources to fixing the financial mess and paying the unpaid bills that had been left behind. In the first half of 2017-18 fiscal year, we have processed some $54 million in bills yet to be paid. Among these were $13.2 million in respect of 573 prior year transactions across the breadth of ministries and departments, of which $3.8 million at the Ministry of Finance, $2.4 million at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Boy, y'all is having a good time. $2.1 million at the Ministry of Public Service and National Insurance, and $887,000 at the Royal Bahamas Police Force. The list of the payables that were $20,000 or higher, I also have available, Mr. Speaker. Another $10.5 million in transactions approved by contingency, of which $3.9 million at the Office of the Attorney General and the Ministry of Legal Affairs, $2.7 million at the Department of Housing. And I just lost my spot. Yeah, the millions got us all mixed up. Oh. Just 1 minute, I'm sorry. Station break. Technology is a wonderful thing. Yep. See if you can find where I am in that, please. I'm not sure what page I was on. So here we go.
Honorable member.
Some $63 million in respect to NHI, Mr. Speaker. $18.9 million owing to the cruise lines. $17.7 million to Bank of the Bahamas in the context of the Educational Guarantee Fund. $11.7 million in prior year outstanding commitments in respect of PHA operations. And $11.4 million in respect of the Fox Hill Community Center. That Fox Hill Community Center. Now, that Fox Hill Community Center is interesting, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to leave that for Fox Hill to talk about. Oh yeah. Because I think it's important. Because I saw some statements with respect to the Fox Hill Community Center, and somebody was complaining about the fact that the lights were not on. They said, and that people had not been paid, so they claim. But, you know, it's interesting, the question that should be asked is, firstly, who owns that building? That's the first question. The second question is, what did it actually cost to construct, not construct, because if it's construction, I can understand $11.4 million, but to renovate that building? And you know, Mr. Speaker, another question that's going to be asked at some point is who was involved in all of that?
Sometimes you'll know.
Mr. Speaker, this is but a smattering of the previous administration's devastating legacy, and I could go on. But on the whole, it is hard to overstate what a profound administrative and management mess we inherited in the administration of our public finances and the oversight of public assets. Mr. Speaker, I am, however, pleased to report that the Ministry of Finance under my watch is not standing by and simply bemoaning the situation. We are addressing all the matters noted above and many more. Yes, Cat Island, we fixing them. Systematically and judiciously. I mean, we can deal with Cat Island too. We can deal with Cat Island too.
He said he can fix you.
Just as we... Just as we are committed to fixing the deficit and reducing the burden of debt, we are equally committed and are working hard to improve the management of public sector finances.
You just better know he got Haitian roots.
We are moving to reshape. We are moving to reshape the Ministry of Finance and its related agencies. We are looking to develop and promote the talent we have. And we are continuing to bring in new talent and new ways of doing things. And Mr. Speaker, that's what excites me the most, because I see the potential in what can happen if we bring in young, eager talent to supplement what we have, the professionals that we have in the civil service today. Mr. Speaker, we have to develop our people and we have to empower them. You know, again, going back to this thing about, the government not speaking about the storms. Mr. Speaker, one of the problems, one of the reasons why our people have been held back is because politicians have been pushing themselves to the front. Every time something has to be said, it has to be a politician. It's ridiculous. We have talented people in the public service, and they will never develop to their full potential if we do not give them the opportunity to make mistakes, yes. To embarrass us sometimes, yes. But you know what? From that, they will learn, and they will develop into the full measure of what they can be and what they can contribute to this country. And so, yes, I am excited about the people that we're bringing in to the service. And we're engaging in training, ongoing training, to bring up those people that are in the service today, to make sure that they have the best opportunity to be successful and to be all that they can be. The Prime Minister makes the comment that the public service ought to be the feeder system for the private sector. No, we have to take that seriously, because it is an opportunity, because there's no place else that you get such a broad view of our country and its economics and society than in government. Very valuable people, but we've got to push them. And yes, at some point, we might even have to push them out the nest and let them fly. Mr. Speaker, they call it victimization. I don't call it that at all. It's opportunity. Opportunity, faith, support. Mr. Speaker, it can only be hoped that the member for Exuma and Ragged Island will quickly learn the hard lessons of responsible public life. If he truly aspires to be an effective servant of his constituents and a responsible and respected member of this honorable House, he needs humbly to remember and disavow his party's disastrous record of governance. And he needs to carefully and dutifully, and I can tell you from my own experience, tactfully, check the facts before he attempts to proffer judgment and advice that will be credible and useful. My friend. Don't get between us. That's my friend. And he gets to speak after me, so I'm sure you. Mr. Speaker. But I do get to speak last, that's true. Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of the member and his colleagues, as well as all Bahamians, let us spend a few moments reviewing the fiscal record of our predecessor. For the financial strain imposed on our children and grandchildren by the irresponsible fiscal management of the party opposite in its 5 years at the helm is such gargantuan proportions that it verges on the immoral. It is for that very reason that we simply cannot put it behind us, so to speak, and as some have suggested, and merely move on as if it had never occurred. It is oft-quoted, in the oft-quoted words of the philosopher George Stanyard, in his life lessons of Life of Reasons, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Mr. Speaker, repeating the fiscal travesty of the last administration must never, ever occur again, nor must it ever be allowed to occur again. Reason indeed must prevail. We as a nation must never forget that during one single mandate, they racked up huge deficit after huge deficit every single year. That is, they ignored the sums of monies that were coming into the Treasury and simply spent as they wished, in the process borrowing money to finance their lax fiscal management. That borrowed money, of course, steadily added to the debt owed by the government to both Bahamian investors and to foreigners. In total, I don't believe that was Alfredus. I don't think so. In total, over their brief 5 years, the direct debt of the government mushroomed from $3.9 billion at the end of 2011-2012 to over $6.5 billion at the end of 2016-2017. That is an increase of over $2.6 billion in 5 short years, or an average of $529 million each and every year.
Any point of order there?
And here's the kicker. They managed to increase the debt while at the same time earning some $1.5 billion in new revenue from the introduction of value-added tax between January 2015 and the end of 2016-17 fiscal year. And so the question is asked, where's the VAT money going?
They never told us that.
The level of expenditure. They ate it up. Wow. They not only ate up the amount of money that they earned in VAT, the additional revenue that they earned in VAT, $1.5 billion, but they went out and borrowed another $2.6 billion. Mr. Speaker. So that's why you can't find the VAT money. It's gone. Poof. Gone. Mr. Speaker. And you know, I heard some comment, and I can address it now because I know the member from Exuma will raise it, that this year our borrowing is close to $1 billion. I think it's yeah, I can tell you now. $750 million of that is to pay some of these same loans, to refinance some of these same loans that we're talking about. Wow. Roll over debt, not new debt, roll over debt. 400 million of it was to pay bills that we met in office.
That's why they got rolled out.
167 million of it is to pay, not to pay, and I want to be careful with the word I use, but to support the Bank of the Bahamas, of which the majority of the issues came under their administration. I didn't say all. They said majority. I didn't say all.
Oh, please. Please.
Well, you don't want me to talk about that, so no, you don't want me to talk about that. You don't want me to talk about that. Yeah, you don't want me to talk about that. Unless you're prepared to throw people under the bus, you don't want me to talk about that. Mr. Speaker. Pardon? Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, all I can say is that I now have some of the records. I now know what I didn't know. You want me to do your political dirty work? I can do that. I'm not going to do your political dirty work. You can do that yourself. But I will if I have to. Mr. Speaker, they effectively took the proverbial national credit card as their own and binge spent to their heart's content. Again, Mr. Speaker, these words are not meant to amuse. For never in the history of our relatively young nation has a government irresponsibly amassed such an incredible amount of debt that, let us not forget, is the debt of the Bahamian people. It is an inescapable obligation of the citizens of today that, if unattended to, will be passed on to the citizens of tomorrow. Indeed, it effectively represents a massive, massive noose around our citizens' neck. Mr. Speaker, yet a few more details of their fiscal record bear repeating at this time, for both the sake of posterity and to clearly set the historical record straight. When in office, our predecessors did develop a tax reform plan that featured a new value-added tax, whose principal aim, among others, was to redress the public finances and reduce the burden of government debt. Well, Mr. Speaker, how did that work out for them, or more importantly, for us? By all accounts, it seemed they felt that it worked out just fine. For lo and behold, they had just discovered the goose that laid the golden egg. In this matter, the raw fiscal data does not lie and clearly speaks for itself. In the first full year of the value-added tax, that being 2015-16, total recurrent revenue was up by $261 million from the previous year, as would have been expected with the introduction of the new tax, and taking into account the reductions announced in respect of other taxes. However, rather than utilizing this newfound money to reduce debt, they proceeded to spend it all and then spend some more. In fact, in that fiscal year alone, the government actually ramped up its spending on programs and services, its so-called discretionary or primary recurring spending, by $302 million. So they made an additional 261 and spent an additional 302. Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of my colleagues opposite, yes, $302 million is a far bigger number than $261 million. But then again, clearly, they're saying to themselves, who cares when the taxpayers of today and tomorrow are footing the bill? Let's have a party. Let's celebrate today. You know, it reminds me of my children. And at Christmas time, they want the most expensive toys. You know? And I sensibly try to tell them, we only make X, and so we can only spend Y. We can't buy that new technology because we can't afford to spend X plus Y. We don't have it. And it certainly doesn't make any sense to go out and borrow it. And you know, I believe I can come to it a little bit later when we talk about the infrastructure. Because if we could see, if we could feel, if we can drive around town and say, this is what they spent the money on, then, you know, we might not feel so bad. But this money just spent, and we have nothing to show for it. Absolutely nothing. Mr. Speaker, during the next fiscal year, 2016-17, recurrent revenue rose by a further $81 million. However, also during that year, the fiscal year that featured a national election in its closing months, primary recurrent expenditure shot up by a whopping $268 million. Catch that now. In 2016-17 year, the election year, VAT revenue increased again by $81 million. But expenditure, the discretionary expenditure, rose by a whopping $268 million. You tell me how that's supposed to work. How that's supposed to work? Hurricane, you say hurricane. Let me give you $150 million. I can give you $150 million. Spot you that. You still got $100 million, $120 million to explain. And you didn't spend 150 because we still paying some of them bills today. We paying them today.
See what he says, cut the cut. I'm voting for.
Mr. Speaker, our government is still picking up the pieces from that inexcusable pre-election splurge and the overhang of unpaid commitments that they left in their wake. Mr. Speaker, as a result, I know you're enjoying it. Yeah, I know. I want to make sure it sink in, because you all don't seem to understand, so I want to make sure you get it. Mr. Speaker, as a result of their actions, in their final year in office, primary recurrent expenditure was $570 million higher than it had been only 2 years earlier, an astounding 38% increase. Let me read it again because there was some noise. Mr. Speaker, as a result of their actions, in their final year in office, primary recurrent expenditure was $570 million higher than it had been only 2 years earlier, an astounding 38% increase. For their part, revenues over those 2 years rose by an appreciable $342 million. Mr. Speaker, however, the party opposite was so profligated that the new revenue, though substantial, was still inadequate to sate their insatiable appetite for spending. Having more than exhausted the new revenue on added spending on programs and services, they, of course, also had to pay servicing costs on the existing debt, as well as pay their capital spending program. Is it any wonder, Mr. Speaker, that government debt ballooned as it did under their stewardship? Their disastrous fiscal legacy will live on forever in the annals of Bahamian history and in the minds of Bahamian citizens. Let us never forget how we got there, and let us redouble our commitment to redressing the situation and never let it happen again. That, Mr. Speaker, brings me to our government's fiscal consolidation plan, whose broad outlines were set out in the May budget communication. As I stated at the time, while we do face a difficult fiscal challenge, we are committed to making the hard decisions that are necessary to eliminate the deficit and put the debt burden on a downward track to lower, more sustainable levels. That is critical to underpinning more buoyant growth of the private sector, investments, and our national economy, freeing up resources to implement the government's bold socioeconomic growth agenda during the current mandate, providing much needed room to maneuver in the event of potential economic and other shocks. And we've seen one today in Eleuthera. As responsible fiscal managers, we recognize that a successful fiscal plan requires a judicious balance of actions in respect of both spending and revenues, as well as measures to bolster economic activity. In the budget communication, I set out the details, the various measures in these areas that we would begin to pursue immediately and going forward. I will shortly turn to a discussion on the progress that we have made so far in the current fiscal year in implementing those various measures. In the budget communication, we also affirmed our desire to bring in the deficit this fiscal year at a lower level than projected, and to that end, to seek to eliminate the primary deficit, and to the extent possible, post a surplus. To that end, the Prime Minister announced in July a 10% cut in discretionary recurrent spending across the board. Our progress to date at the midpoint of the fiscal year was set out in the mid-year statement that I presented 2 weeks ago, and to which I will turn next. However, I'm pleased to note at this time that our actions to date have successfully forestalled a further downgrading of our international credit rating. Going forward, the focus of our fiscal consolidation plan is on lasting structural adjustments to restrain the growth of the primary recurrent spending relative to the size of the economy to levels that are fiscally sustainable while still appropriate for modern governance. giving the social and economic priorities and commitments of the government. Bolster the revenue yields of the tax system to higher and more appropriate levels, in line with those of other nations in the region, by both improving the efficiency of administration and collection of existing taxes and implementing the appropriate and needed modifications to the existing tax structure, and implementing complementary measures to boost the potential growth of the domestic economy. In this context, it is also important to acknowledge the critical infrastructure needs of a modern and dynamic Bahamian economy and society in the period ahead, which will necessitate a judicious balance of public investment in combination with private sector involvement through well-designed and effective public-private partnerships. Mr. Speaker, I will now elaborate on the fiscal outturn at the midterm and the fiscal year. In respect to recurrent expenditures, in line with the particular emphasis that we have placed on the need to reform and restrain recurrent expenditure, I begin with the update in the area of fiscal accounts. Under current practice, recurrent expenditure consists of three principal components, namely primary recurrent expenditure, which represents discretionary current spending, interest payments on government debt, and redemption payment in respect of that debt. It is useful to focus on this delineation of spending, as clearly our focus will need to be on primary recurrent expenditure, that component of spending over which the government has direct control, as we strive to redress the public finances. In the first half of 2017-18 fiscal year, primary recurrent expenditure was successfully contained to a level of $861 million, down from the prorated half-year budget allotment of $975 million. At that level, it represents 44% of the full-year budget allocation of $1,950.7 million. As for the first half outturn for the major components of primary current expenditure, I would note that personal emoluments and allowances totaled $373.2 million, some 47% of the full year allocation of $790 million. Purchases of goods and services totaled $132.9 million, some 36% of the budget allocation of $370.9 million. And grants, fixed charges, and other financial transactions totaled $354.9 million, or some 45% of the full year estimates of $789.8 million. As far as the outturn for recurrent expenditure by head is concerned, I would note that 7 heads account for some 67% of the total expenditure. At the midpoint of the fiscal year, spending in these 7 heads relative to full year budget allocations were as follows. The Ministry of Public Service and National Insurance, $84.9 million, or 34% of its budget allocation. The Ministry of Health, $118.2 million, or 38.4% of its allocation. The Ministry of Tourism and Aviation, $43.5 million, or 39.5% of its allocation. The Ministry of Finance, $85.8 million, or 40.1% of its allocation. The Ministry of Education, $43.5 million, or 46% of its allocation. The Royal Bahamas Police Force, $65.6 million, or 48.1% of its allocation. And the Department of Education, $99.5 million, or 50.7% of its allocation. Besides primary recurrent expenditure, the 2 other major categories of recurrent expenditure are interest payments and debt redemption. During the first half, the former, meaning interest payments, totaled $141.7 million, broadly in line with the full year estimate of $292.5 million. Just think about that. $292.5 million in interest. Think what we could do with that money. Debt redemption in the first half, however, amounted to $787.4 million, as compared to the full year estimate of $432.7 million. This, of course, reflects the repayment in the first half of the short-term financing that the government secured to meet immediate financing needs after coming into office. The proceeds of the November $750 million bond issue was utilized to effect these debt repayments. Mr. Speaker, in my midterm statement 2 weeks ago, I pointed that our salary bill had grown by some $15 million, driven primarily by payments of overtime due to the police and payments arising from the fulfillment of public sector industrial agreements. Some critics, including those who ought to know better, have made a host of claims regarding this government engaging in a massive retrenchment of public sector staff, essentially that we had fired thousands of Bahamians. But the reality tells a different story, and it speaks to what the former administration was really doing with the people's money in the lead up to the elections. During the last fiscal year, government records indicate that, not including parliamentarians or summer students, the government added 2,260 persons to the direct public sector payroll.
In the last year?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last fiscal year. During the last fiscal year, government records indicate that the government added 2,260 persons to the direct public sector payroll. Of that number, and that's only what I know. That's the information that I have, and I'm sure the Minister for the Public Service will quickly correct those numbers. Of that number, some 654 persons were hired as permanent and pensionable, or intended for eventual permanent or placement as permanent employees. Given that there was then, and still remain, legitimate skill set needs in the public sector, let us grant to the other side, for the sake of argument, that these 654 permanent employment opportunities were legitimate. Mr. Speaker, that means that still some 1,606 persons, and it may be more, substantially more, I'm being told, was brought on the public payroll in contractual and temporary arrangements, many of whom were classified as general service workers, going into agencies to fill no specific duty or meet no specific shortage. The annualized salary bill for these contractual employees is $27 million. I repeat, the annual bill to carry these employees is $27 million. These were sums that were not fully budgeted for. These were not for positions for which there was a need. These persons who made these decisions did not care that the budget performance was tanking and that prudence and discipline should have been the order of the day.
What would that mean?
What were they thinking, Mr. Speaker? As you say, Freetown, I don't think they know what that meant. I don't think they know what it meant. What was their motivation? To keep doling out the borrowed cash while the country crashed and burned. And now, with a full measure of false piety, they want to sit over there and question our math and accounting. The Bahamian people, fortunately, are waking up. And we'll continue to educate them. We'll continue to educate them, Mr. Speaker, so they can understand fully the finances of our country. That is a commitment that I make to the Bahamian people. I want to make sure that every adult contributing citizen in this country, and yes, even our children, as we seek to put personal financial planning and management in our school system, that they understand what these numbers mean. that they understand how our economy works, that they understand money management, so that when somebody comes to them with these pie-in-the-sky talk, that they can discern for themselves what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Mr. Speaker. For clarity, you ain't got no traction with this old band thing, man, so stop that. For clarity.
No, you mean Ray-Ban, sunglasses.
The figures quoted above for the numbers of contractual workers does not include the many temporary and contractual workers hired before the last fiscal year. The status of many of whom was left unresolved by the previous government after their contracts would have been expired for months and years. Mr. Speaker, we are systematically addressing the issues of temporary and contractual staff, and the government is doing its best to place these contractual workers in areas where there is legitimate need. However, given our fiscal situation and our pressing need to recruit and retain professional skill sets into the public service, we will continue to review the status of all temporary employees to be judicious and fair in our dealings. In June of 2017, the first full month after this government came into office, and after the increase in staff by over 2,000 in the final year of the formal government, the Treasury payroll processed salaries for 20,177 employees. In December of 2017, the Treasury processed salaries for 19,312 employees, for a net downward movement of 865 fewer employees. Of that 865 downward movements, some 222 would be persons retiring and moving to government pension. The remaining movements of 643 would largely reflect expired temporary contracts that the government chose not to renew, as well as resignations and terminations that are part of natural attrition in government. I'm told I should repeat that, so I shouldn't repeat it. How far do you want me to go? In June 2017, 20,177 people were on the payroll as verified by salary payments. In December of 2017, 19,312 employees were processed for 865 fewer salary payments.
So it wasn't 2,500.
It ain't 2,500 according to my record. Maybe they can tell me where the 25 is.
They know how to fix up the
Of that 865 downward movement, some 222 would be retiring and moving to government pension. The remaining 643 would largely reflect expired temporary contracts that the government, those 3 months contracts and 6 months contracts, that the government chose not to renew, as well as resignations and terminations that are part of natural attrition in the government. You keep asking about those women in the airport in Eleuthera. Anyway, I'm going to leave that. My point, I can let somebody else answer that. My point is, because I remember in defense of these two women, the member for Engliston actually had the nerve to actually say that they may have been hired for political reasons. Check the record. Check the record. Check the record. Check the record. Check the record.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. The member for East Grand Bahama is misrepresenting. I never said that anybody may have been employed for political reasons. I said they were terminated for political reasons, not because they retired, not because their contracts expired, not that long list you gave. So, Speaker, I'm asking that member to withdraw that because I never said those women were hired for political reasons. I want you to withdraw it.
Honorable member.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw.
Honorable member, I also want to make sure the record does not reflect a matter that I have already expunged from the record. I expunge the member of Anguston's statement with respect to the ladies from Eleuthero being terminated for political reason because it was not substantiated. And she's seeking to put it back on the record today, and I want to expunge it one more time for the record. Honorable member. Honorable member, you are not recognized by the chair. What is your point?
Recognizing Engliston, Mr. Speaker? Yes, but usually you call the name. You said I was not recognized. Am I recognized, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, you are recognized.
Speaker.
What is your point?
The point is this, Mr. Speaker, that I laid on the table of this Parliament a newspaper report with an interview with the Minister of Tourism where he made certain admissions and assertions in support of what I asserted. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's correct that you should expunge from the record, Speaker, that there is a document that is being laid on the table of this Parliament.
When was that document laid?
You were not here, Mr. Speaker. For 3 weeks ago, Speaker.
I was not here?
No, Mr. Speaker, you were not here.
And was that after the matter was expunged?
It was after it was expunged, Mr. Speaker, and I brought evidence to support the assertion, Mr. Speaker. Wasn't that the objection, that I did not support it? Speaker, so Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's correct that you should expunge that from the record, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
No.
Mr. Speaker, if I may.
I adopted it, and the member has not refuted it, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, in those circumstances, I asked two things, that the member withdraw what he said, I said, which I never said. And, Mr. Speaker, that I'm asking that you not expunge from the record something that I have supported in this Parliament by laying a document in the Parliament.
Honourable member, the position of the chair is this. If you are asserting that the chair was absent when you tabled that document,
yeah,
the chair would satisfy itself
okay, no problem,
that document was indeed tabled and that there was no, that you adopted it. And so I will reserve my decision
you could be
pending a review of the handed record.
You can be assured, Mr. Speaker, I would not assert it if it were not so. I mean, everyone in here saw it, Mr. Speaker. They're laughing, Mr. Speaker, you know, they're laughing. It's the same crew, Mr. Speaker, who had a fake signing, and the Bahamian people want to know who signed that Mr. Speaker. That's right, Mr. Speaker. So the credibility is very strange, Speaker.
Honourable member, resume your seat.
Can I ask Mr. Speaker on that? Can I get your ruling on that? I'd like that. I'd be grateful if you could resolve that at the earliest opportunity and not leave it. The document was laid on the table of Parliament.
Well, Honourable member, I have made my position clear.
Yes.
You are saying that I was absent when it was laid.
Everyone else was here, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I was absent. That's what you were saying.
Yes, you were.
So I am going to satisfy myself.
So, Mr. Speaker.
And then we can move on.
Okay. Thank you, Mr.
Once
Speaker.
I've satisfied myself, I would notify
I ask that the member withdraw his statement, Mr. Speaker.
Will withdraw my statement, my comment. It was what I understood, but I accept that I could have been wrong in that, and I withdraw it. So, Mr. Speaker, I would similarly like to ask the member to withdraw her comment with respect to some fake signature, some fake signing, Mr. Speaker.
Yep.
Mr. Speaker.
No.
Honourable member for Angleston, with respect to the request for the withdrawal.
If I could clarify, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that the member has given me the opportunity. Speaker.
There can be no
You've not been recognized.
Honourable member.
Speaker, yes, Mr. Speaker.
The statement.
Yes, the statement is this, Mr. Speaker.
No. The statement that is the member
yes.
seeking for withdrawal.
We saw a signing that we are now learning was not a real signing.
Honourable member. No explanation. No explanation is required.
Well, I withdraw, Mr. Speaker. There was a fake signing. What was that? What was that, Mr. Speaker? What was that? I tried to get clarification this morning, Mr. Speaker. There was a document signed by an individual who signed someone else's name in the public domain.
Honourable member. Resume your seat. Honourable member, just a moment, please. It is the order of the chair that the statement of Angleston, the member for Angleston, with respect to fake signatures, be expunged from the record.
Mr. Speaker, again, the going back to my point, of the 865 downward movement in employees, some 222 would be retiring persons moving to pensions. The remaining movement of 643 would largely reflect expired temporary contracts that the government chose not to renew, as well as resignations and terminations that are part of natural attrition in the government. My point is that despite the fiction being perpetrated by the idle crew on the opposite side, there has been no widespread firings by the government.
You know that's what you're going to do.
The majority of the 2,000 plus persons brought on by the former government and almost all of the necessary professional full-time staff recruited by the former government continue to remain in the employ of the government. And as we sort through the legitimate needs of the public service, we will give the current contractual staff in good standing the opportunity to fill these slots where there are legitimate needs, ever mindful of the fact, however, that we are compelled to rationalize cost where there is no case to continue spending money. This we must do as the stewards of the Bahamian taxpayers' money. That said, I conclude from these various first half figures, Mr. Speaker, that on the whole, we have indeed made significant progress so far in restraining discretionary recurrent expenditure toward the goal of achieving the 10% target full year reduction, even with the burden of the ramp up in staff counts. Having said that, we must and we will persevere in the restraint of expenditure over the second half of the fiscal year. And I'm going to repeat that for my own colleagues, Mr. Speaker. Having said that, colleagues, we must and we will persevere in the restraint of expenditure over the second half of the fiscal year. In this context, however, it is important not to lose sight of the onerous overhang commitments with which we must still deal going forward. And some, Mr. Speaker, are of a litigious nature. It's unfortunate that some of the agreements that we have found in place, we are seemingly handcuffed, even though we have no need of the service. And so we have to figure out how we can equitably exit some of these arrangements that the previous government put us into. Things like leases for properties that no one ever set foot in the building. But we owe $13 million in one case, $14 million in another case. And not one government worker ever put his foot in the building. And in order, there's no exit clauses. No, the lease cannot be terminated. And so we have to pay out to the end. So they say. We're stuck. $13 million, $14 million.
Nobody in the building.
Never been in it. One building was even destroyed by a hurricane. But we still, according to the lease, allegedly according to the lease, oh, and we have to pay. I don't know. I just don't understand. You wouldn't do it with your own money. That's all I know. Nobody would do this with their own money. No way. As such, Mr. Speaker, while we've made positive strides to restrain our own expenditure, it is evident that with these overhang commitments, we will need to be doubly vigilant over the balance of the fiscal year if we are to achieve the objective of bringing the 2017-18 GFS deficit below the level projected in the budget communication. Mr. Speaker, on the capital expenditure front, in the first half of the year, I would note that the outturn clearly reflects the government's proactive efforts to hold back on spending in order to secure critical near-term improvements in the fiscal position. Only critical and meaningful public investments were approved. As a result, capital expenditure over the July to December period totaled $75.8 million, which represents only 33% of the budget allocation of $229.7 million. The capital expenditures of the Ministry of Finance, in particular, were restrained in the first half, amounting to $15 million out of the budget allotment of $72.5 million. So the Ministry of Finance is putting its money where its mouth is. Of the latter amount, $47 million was allocated for the acquisition, construction, and improvement of capital assets, but only $9.2 million was spent. Another $25.5 million was allotted for grants, fixed charges, and other financial transactions, of which $5.8 million was spent. The Minister of Works and other ministers will go into detail on the specific plans for their capital works for the remainder of the fiscal year. But I do want to say that, consistent with the clear and urgent demands that we address critical needs, we anticipate that we will utilize the majority of the budget allocation for the capital expenditures. But unlike our predecessors in office, the Bahamian people will be able to see and account for what and for where this money was spent. The monies will be spent judiciously to meet the needs of the Bahamian people and not the narrow interests of self-serving politicians. Indeed, during its 5 years in office, the previous government spent well over $1.6 billion on capital expenditure, and Bahamians are left to wonder where that sum of money was spent and precisely on what. In the fiscal tables that were presented 2 weeks ago, the data for the capital expenditure of the Ministry of Finance also included $69 million that the government had to spend from existing resources to invest in Resolve Corporation, the special purpose vehicle that was used to relieve the Bank of the Bahamas of toxic loans. Under our predecessors, Resolve was created to acquire the toxic loans of the Bank of the Bahamas as a means of facilitating the latter's needed restructuring and return to financial viability. Mr. Speaker, this is another vivid example of the misdeeds and corrupt practices that were rampant under our predecessors. The financial difficulties encountered by the Bank of the Bahamas stemmed in large measure from the very large loans that it extended to certain persons with appropriate connections or so-called politically exposed persons, without doing the due diligence or securing the necessary collateral that prudential commercial practices would dictate. The amounts owing under these toxic loans were in many cases in the millions of dollars and ranged as high as $28 million to one such politically exposed person. Our investigations into this travesty is far from complete, and we shall have more to say in due course. And we are commencing a forensic audit. Mr. Speaker, the Bahamian people will be interested. That's all I got to say. The Bahamian people will be interested, not only in the loans that were transferred to Resolve, but equally as interested in those loans that were written off. As I mentioned in the mid-year statement, the government has had to seek new borrowing authority from Parliament in the amount of $100 million to facilitate the retirement of the original $100 million promissory note issued by Resolve to the bank in respect of the initial tranche of toxic loans transferred. The $65 million expended in the first half of the fiscal year was part of that $100 million. And so we're borrowing now to replace $69 million that we paid from recurrent revenue to replace the $69 million that we had to transfer to Bank of the Bahamas. You know, some people say we should have a fire sale, and it's important, you know, Mr. Speaker. And I think I might repeat myself, so let me just read through. In August and September of last year, Resolve purchased additional toxic loans from the Bank of the Bahamas with a gross book value of $167.7 million in exchange for a promissory note of equal value. The redemption of these promissory notes will come due in the ensuing fiscal periods, and we shall transparently make provisions for the same. The government is of the view that the Bank of the Bahamas can be returned to profitability under its new board of directors as the bank continues to implement its transformation strategy. For the government, the priority is to protect depositors and staff jobs, in addition to preventing any systemic impact to the wider economy and the banking system in general from a failure of the Bank of the Bahamas. Now, Mr. Speaker, some people say we should sell the bank, and we are open to such a move. Some people say we should shut down the bank. But the reality is that we went through this analysis in whether we ought to support the bank or shut it down. And the reality was that it costs more to shut it down than it is to support it. And so we give it a life. We believe in our board. We believe that they're making the right moves, and we are leaving politics out of it. And, you know, that has been my commitment to the board, and I have maintained that. As in the case with Long Island today and South Andres, where the Royal Bank of Canada has decided to move out, we have asked the Bank of the Bahamas to look into those markets to see whether they can provide service. And they have come back with a proposition, and we're going to have to make some decisions from a political level as to how far we want to go in supporting that. But the bank itself will not be made to go into a jurisdiction where it cannot sustain itself. We will not do that. And so to the extent that the government has to do something, then the government will do something. But our first inclination is, to the extent that the Bank of the Bahamas cannot do it, then we will find a way to empower some private sector entities to go into those markets and provide the services to the Bahamian people. They deserve that service. And we cannot leave these cash and go, maybe one of them, I don't know. It depends on how he deals with me. But we cannot leave these communities unbanked. That is for sure. And so something has to happen. And so we're still working through the dynamics of that. And as I say, if the Bank of the Bahamas cannot rationalize its costs, then we're going to have to encourage some private sector partners to go into there and provide some form of services. But I can assure those communities that they will have some level of financial service as we go forward. Well, let me not say that. I would also note that Resolve's new board has been encouraged by government to quicken its pace to sell off all assets and thereby reclaim taxpayer funds. As for the capital expenditures of other ministries, I would note that in the first 6 months of the fiscal year, the Ministry of Public Works spent $39 million as compared to its full year allocation of $113.3 million. Noteworthy in this regard was the $30.2 million spent on the acquisition, construction, and improvement of capital assets out of the total budget of $90.5 million. Likewise, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force expended $840,000 out of the allotment of $20.3 million. For its part, the Ministry of Education, for valid reasons that all will appreciate, virtually exhausted its entire capital expenditure allocation during the first half, spending $21 million out of a full year budget of $22.6 million. And I'm sure the Minister of Education will speak to that. Mr. Speaker, while capital expenditure is clearly an area of the budget that is amenable to near-term adjustment for the sake of contributing to immediate fiscal objectives, it is equally clear that such spending going forward will be vital to ensure that our public infrastructure is up to the standards of a modern Bahamas. To that end, the government will, as a core priority during this mandate, need to substantially invest in our nation's hospitals, clinics, schools, airports, and, near and dear to me, our digital infrastructure. Our government fully appreciates the vital role to be played by effective infrastructure investments in underpinning the most buoyant growth of productivity, our national economy, enhancing job opportunities for our citizens. The key challenge will be to identify creative and efficient ways, including private-public partnerships where appropriate, to finance such investments. Turning to the recurring revenue, the performance of our revenue system is equally critical to prospects for the successful implementation of government's fiscal consolidation plan. During the first half of the fiscal year, total recurrent revenue amounted to $880.7 million, which represents only 41% of the full year projection of $2 $6.15 billion set out in the budget communication. However, in light of the traditional unevenness of revenue collections during the course of the fiscal year, such an outturn should not be overly surprising. Indeed, at the midpoint of the 4 previous years, recurrent revenue collections have varied between 39.9% and 45.5% of eventual full-year outturns. However, having said that, I do believe firmly that for the sake of fiscal prudence, we must persist in our ongoing efforts to both restrain spending and further enhance the collection of revenues if we are to meet the targets of our fiscal consolidation plan, both this year and moving forward. With recurrent revenue, tax revenue is the dominant component, representing fully 85.7% of the total. And within tax revenue, the 5 major categories and their performance in the first half of the fiscal year are as follows. VAT, $312.1 million, or 47.2% of the full year forecast. Import duties, $136.1 million, or 41.7%. Excise tax, $120.3 million, or 43.7%. Tourism tax, $59.5 million, or 41.1%. And property tax, $31.8 million, or just 22.2%. From these data, it is evident that property tax is an area in which renewed emphasis must be placed to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the system. While there are clear in-year timing considerations in respect to the billing and payment of taxes, it is also widely acknowledged that ongoing efforts at system reform and modernization must be diligently pursued. While non-tax revenue, the dominant category, within non-tax revenue, the dominant category is that of fees and services, which, with a full year forecast of $306.9 million, represents 85% of the total. During the first half of the fiscal year, however, collections in respect of fees and services amount to $106.7 million, or only 35% of the full year budget estimate. As such, it would appear that this is another area of the revenue system that requires attention to ensure that amounts are proper. Let me see what page I'm on. It's up to you. I have about 10, 15 minutes. Up to you.
The chair recognizes the honourable member for St. Anne's.
I'd like to finish. Up to you. I'd like to finish. Let's get it done.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to move that we carry on beyond 1 o'clock to allow the honourable member to finish in the next 10 minutes or so.
Second. It's been moved and seconded that the business of the House do carry on beyond 1 p.m. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will rise. The business of the House will carry on beyond the 1 o'clock hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, turning to the primary balance and GFS deficit. On the basis of the outturn for the major fiscal aggregates in the first half of 2017-18, the GFS deficit at mid-year amounted to $198 million, down significantly from the deficit of $290.3 million posted at the midpoint of the previous year. As was mentioned in the mid-year statement, the first half deficit this year represents some 61% of the full year forecast of $323 million. Relative to the previous year, primary recurrent expenditure was down by $6.9 million, the magnitude of which was significantly affected by the overhang commitments for which we have had to provide. Interest payments were up by $15.8 million. Current capital expenditure were down by $76.4 million, and recurrent revenues were up by $24.8 million. With these developments, the primary fiscal balance in the first half of 2017-18 fiscal year came in at a deficit of $56.3 million, down sharply from the deficit of $164 million recorded in the first half of the previous fiscal year. That's worth noting again. The deficit at the end of this year, or this first half, $56.3 million, as compared to the previous administration. At this same point, they were down $164 million. Mr. Speaker, on the basis of these developments and the government's unflinching commitment the full implementation, the 10% across-the-board reduction in discretionary spending, I remain confident that we will indeed better the GFS deficit forecast this fiscal year. I also expect, Mr. Speaker, that we will succeed in slightly reducing, if not completely eliminating, the primary fiscal deficit as well. I'm sure the public wondering what y'all are laughing at.
The optics.
Mr. Speaker, measures to reduce the public finances. Mr. Speaker, I now turn briefly to major policy initiatives in the 2017-18 budget communication. In light of the magnitude of the primary fiscal imbalance that we faced upon coming to office, we have, as I mentioned earlier, adopted a judicious and balanced approach to fiscal consolidation that comprises actions to both restrain expenditure and enhance revenues. On the expenditure front, we announced in the 2017-18 budget communication that we would launch an in-depth and extensive review of all government programs and services. Beyond contributing to deficit reduction, that review also seeks to enhance value for money, improve services to make them more efficient and effective, and identify savings and reallocations to accommodate our core policy priorities. As an immediate cost-saving measure, we have, as I've mentioned, the 10% reduction that all ministries and departments must implement in respect of their discretionary expenditures. That will go a long way to securing our stated objective of bringing the 2017-18 GFS deficit lower than the level projected in the budget. For its part, the in-depth review of expenditure is expected to make a significant and permanent contribution to deficit reduction going forward. We are, as well, pursuing measures to strengthen the accountability and transparency of the Ministry of Finance, including the recent creation of a new senior position within the ministry in the form of a Deputy Financial Secretary with responsibility for strengthening the operational capacity of the ministry. And I would like to congratulate the former Treasurer, Ms. Eugenia Cartwright, who has been appointed to that position. The Ministry of Finance is also pursuing the implementation and successful completion of the IDB Finance Public Financial Management and Performance Monitoring Reform Project. The objective of this important exercise is to enhance the capacity of the ministry to reduce and provide access to high quality information for evidence-based policymaking, as well as improve the ability to better allocate and track public funds. In this regard, the ministry will also work to strengthen its analytical capacity in the area of fiscal policy development and implementation. The government is also launching a diagnostic review of its information technology unit and developing an appropriate public sector reform strategy in this area going forward. Also in development are the implementation of a new modern chart of accounts that is fully compatible with international standards, as well as a transition to an accruals basis of accounting for the public financial accounts, which we are targeting for prompt introduction, possibly as early as 2020. On the revenue enhancement side, the Ministry of Finance has also been mandated to renew its enhancement of the revenue collection program. To that end, the Revenue Enhancement Unit is being recast to ensure that revenue is properly and fully collected across the major tax types. A renewed push is also being made to recruit and train Bahamians to undertake the all-important tax audit activities of a modern and efficient tax system. To this end, the Cabinet of the Bahamas has approved the recruitment of 15 young Bahamian accountants to be trained as tax auditors, eventually taking over the work that the former administration had outsourced to foreign consultants at extremely high cost, with no plans in place to train and equip Bahamians to take their place. But this, like with so many other things, this government will fix. This government does not play with words when it says, we believe in Bahamians. New revenue administration legislation is also under development that will, among other things, significantly strengthen the enforcement powers of the revenue agencies. In addition, the government is striving to transform its state-owned enterprises into self-sufficient entities, as was laid out in the budget communication. Funding in the amount of $429 million was provided for 25 state-owned enterprises in the 2017-18 fiscal year, representing an increase of $79 million from the previous fiscal year. Such a drain on the public finances must clearly be rationalized. To that end, the government has directed each state-owned enterprise, that is Bahamas Air, Water and Sewage, BPL, etc., to articulate a plan to move towards a cost recovery operating model, which may include a mix of revenue enhancement initiatives, as well as measures to reduce expenditures in line with industry benchmarks. The state-owned enterprises are now formulating articulated strategies that we expect will take them to this optimized point within 3 to 5 years. The government is also moving forward, as was announced in the May budget, with the elaboration of fiscal responsibility legislation and fiscal rules that, if all progresses as anticipated, we plan to table with the next budget communication. The purpose of such legislation is to guide the formulation and implementation of fiscal policy objectives, guide the annual budget within a medium-term fiscal framework, and facilitate effective public scrutiny and oversight of fiscal responsibility arrangements. The provisions of the proposed law will be structured around and will be guided by the general principles of responsible fiscal management, namely accountability, responsibility, fairness, stability, and transparency. In general terms, the overall fiscal objectives that will be embodied in the law could include a combination of achieving and maintaining a zero or positive fiscal balance over the medium term, achieving and maintaining prudent levels of public debt, ensuring predictability in the level of tax rates and basis for future years, responsible managing fiscal risk, and achieving macroeconomic stability, inclusive growth, environmental sustainability, and intergenerational equity. The specific fiscal rules that will be included in the draft legislation are still under development, but among a number of options could include such fiscal parameters as a ceiling on the deficit and a cap on the growth of expenditure. As well, the draft law will provide for the consequences of missing the legislated fiscal objectives and the adjustment actions to be taken to ensure that those objectives are subsequently met. In other words, we're putting in rules, we're going to make them transparent, we're going to make ourselves accountable, and to the extent that we exceed or breach those rules, we will be made accountable in this Parliament to the Bahamian people for those breaches. And we must present a plan to fix it. So this thing we have in the last fiscal year where they ran away with that ridiculous amount of spending will not be allowed to happen. Mr. Speaker, and we're putting in the rules to make sure it doesn't happen. Mr. Speaker, as I stated unambiguously earlier, we must never repeat the disastrous fiscal experience of the previous administration. I am confident that this legislation will ensure that that does not happen. As well, we are proceeding with preparation of new debt management legislation that is also targeted for tabling within the next budget communication. To that end, the Central Bank has approached the Commonwealth Secretariat to provide technical assistance for drafting appropriate legislation to modernize our public debt management infrastructure. Work to date suggests that establishing a new framework consistent with international best practices that is designed to support a properly functioning debt management regime. That framework would include, for further consideration and possible implementation, the establishment of a public debt management office responsible for debt management activities, the establishment of a public debt management advisory committee to guide the government's borrowing practices and debt management operations, the establishment of a public debt management strategy in line with the government's fiscal policy and budget framework, with which all borrowing and other debt management activities will need to comply, the establishment of mandatory requirements for reporting to Parliament by the Ministry of Finance, including on the performance of debt management relative to the strategy, as well as all guarantees issued by the government, and the provision of external audit requirements of all debt management activities. Mr. Speaker, in the interest of time, I'm going to speed past new procurement legislation. Well, let me finish them because I'm almost there. the government intends to introduce new legislation in the area of procurement, and e-procurement in particular. The focus on this more modern framework would be on enhancing the transparency of bidding procedures. This legislation will be revolutionary in many respects. In large part, it will discourage, in the most transparent of ways, the practice of simply handing out patronage to cronies away from the eyes of the taxpayers who are footing the bill. I am eager, Mr. Speaker, to share with the member for Cat Island, he's not here, as well as his colleagues over on that side, who I understand is gearing up to pull a palace coup. Exactly what we have seen on how contracts were doled out by the Ministry of Works under the watch of the member for Cat Island. They were done skillfully to evade the tender process. The Bahamian people are going to see once again the games they were playing with taxpayer money to avoid scrutiny and channel monies to other places. As opposed to giving an opportunity to all suitable Bahamian companies to have a fair opportunity to bid on public works. But I will share that story with the member separately. In addition to the much-needed transparency, and I'm sure the Ministry of Works is going to talk about some of that too, in addition to the much-needed transparency in the spending of taxpayers' money that this new procurement legislation will introduce, the legislation will also allow the Minister to set aside specific bids solely for small business, Bahamian businesses. So we are setting aside, Mr. Speaker, a set percentage of government procurement for small, medium-sized business, Bahamian businesses. We want to ensure that we give these small entities an opportunity to survive and to grow in this dog-eat-dog competitive world. This will allow them to get an opportunity to bid on government jobs and get the chance to grow and flourish, and to do so in a manner where they do not have to go to any member, or even to the member for East Grand Bahama, or any politician to get an opportunity to bid on work. More specifically, the e-procurement and supplier registry system will create a unique means of access that is simple and easy to use for all opportunities within the government of the Bahamas. It will reduce barriers to access for small and medium-sized enterprises and will allow the entire procurement process to be managed electronically. Users will therefore be able to access tender advertisements, submit bids, and be advised of the awarding of contracts electronically. The launch of the first phase of the supplier registry, which involves business registrations only, occurred on February 5th, 2018. Phase 2, full tendering, will commence in mid-2018. Mr. Speaker, it virtually goes without saying that with the level of unemployment in this country and the annual rate of increase of our labor force, it is critically important that we succeed in boosting the rate of employment, the rate of growth of our economy. We have been steadfast in our commitment to that goal, as it will bring significant benefits not only in terms of new and expanded job opportunities, but also in respect to contributing to our plan for fiscal consolidation. Improving the ease of doing business in this country is a core component of our strategy to bolster economic growth. As a key component of that initiative, the Ministry of Finance has formed a cross-agency committee to examine how to make the business license application process easier, faster, and more efficient. The committee consists of representatives from finance and the major government agencies responsible for issuing approvals required to open a business, and that is the Department of Physical Planning, the Ministry of Works, the Department of Environmental Health Services, and the Royal Bahamas Police Force. The ultimate goal of the committee is to streamline the entire business license process to allow much faster approval times through greater use of digital platforms that will support integration of systems between agencies for complete online services. And that is my focus, Mr. Speaker. If nothing else, if I do nothing in the next 5 years, I'm going to automate that process. Our focus has been on making the system faster, easier, and better. To that end, we are making the business license system faster by shortening the time required to secure both new and renewed licenses. Easier, stress-free, and more citizen-centered by fostering greater interagency cooperation to facilitate the acquisition of licenses, and better through improved service delivery via a single point of contact. Phase 1 of the committee's work involving streamlining the prerequisites for obtaining a business license in order to facilitate the initial permitting approval process starting February 5th, 2018. The Department of Inland Revenue made its website a centralized repository for information and applications relating to opening a business. The site contains information on the requirements of various government agencies for their approvals and permits. And more significantly, it allows applicants to complete online application forms for approval from Physical Planning, Ministry of Works, Building Control, and Environment Health. The form is submitted simultaneously to all three agencies, and the agencies then contact the applicant as necessary to complete the approval process. So you can submit online all of the requirements for a business license. Those agencies will do their work, and they will contact the applications for any follow-ups. And that is in process now. This reduces the time it takes to get approvals, and it eliminates the need for applicants to travel to a number of different agencies and to submit the same information multiple times. In addition, the new process eliminates the needs to go to National Insurance Board for a physical NIB letter of good standing, as upon submission of an application for a business license, NIB now sends confirmation status electronically to the business license unit. Thank you to the minister. He's not there. In phase 2, to be completed by July 2018, we are amending the business license law and eliminating unnecessary steps in the process. More specifically, the Business License Act is being amended to allow for 3-month provisional licenses so that business activities can commence quickly and unhindered. We will also provide for separate licenses for new and amended applicants. As well, licenses for renewals will be granted without prerequisites. The fee schedule for micro and small and medium-sized enterprises with turnovers under $250,000 is also being reviewed. In phase 3, the streamlining of the entire process will be completed, including one point of contact, a back-end compliance and accounting unit, provision for one unique case number to be shared across all agencies, the risk assessment of cases based on the nature of the business, provision for home-based businesses to be approved in 1 day, and low-risk shop and office businesses to be approved within 48 hours. I'm working for 24 hours. By the completion of phase 3 in January 2019, the new system will also include the complete integration of systems between agencies and complete online services, including the submission of applications and reservation of business names through the Office of the Registrar General. The government is also reviewing legislation and policies that make it onerous to both start a business as well as conduct business. That includes reviewing and easing, to the extent possible, the requirements for tax compliance certificates. We are also striving to improve financial inclusion across the archipelago. To that end, we are engaged in discussions with the Clearing Banks Association and the Central Bank to expand the access of all Bahamians to formal banking facilities through the use of digital technology. Mr. Speaker, we have introduced the Commercial Enterprise Act to promote the establishment of new business undertakings and services with an investment of at least $250,000 and a number of specific areas of activities, including leading-edge sectors such as nanotechnology and bioinformatics and analytics. The Act also provides for the prescription of any island or part thereof to be specified commercial enterprise zones for the purpose of rationalizing infrastructure investments, efficient land use, or the encouragement of clusters of commercial development. Incentives may also be prescribed in respect of such specific commercial enterprise zones. In addition, the Act liberalizes the granting of work permits to any enterprise that seeks to establish itself in our country and requires permits for its specialized management teams and specialized key personnel. Mr. Speaker, the government is firmly committed and dedicated to the growth and expansion of micro and small and medium-sized enterprises in the Bahamas. It is widely acknowledged that these enterprises comprise the so-called backbone of the private sector and our responsibility for generating the bulk of new job opportunities. Central to our thrust in this area is the recently approved strategy to promote the development of micro and small and medium-sized enterprises that is founded on the 7 key policy pillars to guide specific policy prescriptions for these enterprises. These 7 key policy pillars are as follows: improving the enabling environment for micro and small and medium-sized enterprises by facilitating their interaction with public and regulatory entities, easing the process to obtain licenses and certificates, as well as the use of digital platforms to fulfill tax and regulatory requirements, increasing direct financing to MSMEs through the commitment of $25 million over 5 years for such measures as microloans, small business loans, grants, and guarantee facilities through commercial banking sectors, enhancing MSMEs' business development support through the establishment of the Small Business Development Center, providing specific support for entrepreneurship and MSME development within marginalized groups, with specific fundings and support set aside for youth and for poor and for women and other underserved communities, fostering a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation with support for curriculum-based programs such as junior achievement and for financial literacy and entrepreneurial programs within the school systems, strengthening corporate governance and minimizing outside political interference with MSME enabling agencies, and promoting greater linkages between MSMEs and other domestic and international sectors of our economy so that small businesses have more opportunities to sell their goods and services inside the country and outside. On the matter of new Small Business Development Center, I would add that this is an initiative spearheaded by the government, the University of the Bahamas, and the Bahamas Chamber of Commerce and Employers Confederation, with support from the Organization of American States. I just have so much to say, I'm sorry. The center will provide a resource for all Bahamians to receive advisory and technical support when seeking to open a business and expand their operations. Mr. Speaker, the Grand Bahama economy is obviously very near and dear to me. And I'm not going to speak to it. But, Mr. Speaker, the moves that the government is making in respect to revitalizing the Grand Bahama economy are not only intangible, but they are tangible. Mr. Speaker, I've heard a lot of commentary in the last couple of weeks about our efforts to move the Grand Bahamian economy forward. But as I said to a reporter, he who knows it feels it, Mr. Speaker. Oh, yeah. He who feels it knows it. Because the Grand Bahama economy has been allowed to go to the levels it has never, ever been, Mr. Speaker. And it requires bold action in order to make it recover, to revive it. And so, Mr. Speaker, we are committed. We are committed to reviving Grand Bahama by any means necessary. And, Mr. Speaker, we are making progress in that regard. Mr. Speaker, the developments that the Prime Minister has already outlined with respect to West End, with respect to the city of Freeport, with respect to the tourism sector, with respect to the industrial sector, Mr. Speaker, are going to pay dividends to Grand Bahama and to this country. And so we look forward to developments that are coming, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I wish to encourage my colleagues, as I do the wider community in the country, to remain focused on discipline in our economic undertakings and to our fiscal consolidation plan. Mr. Speaker, our efforts are bearing fruit, and if we maintain steadfast in our approach, the Bahamian people will see the results, and our country overall will benefit. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there a second? The chair recognizes the honourable member for Long Island. Yes, thank you, honourable. The chair recognizes the honourable member for St. Anne's.
Due to that short overrun, 10-minute overrun, I stand to move suspension till 3:30 this afternoon, March 7th.
Thank you. Is there a seconder? It has been, is there any objection by the opposition? No objection? It has been moved and seconded that the business of this House do suspend to 3:30 p.m. this afternoon. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will rise. The business of the House stands suspended until 3:30 p.m. this afternoon.
No extra 10 minutes.